Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming so early, so promptly, so that we can have this meeting about this incredibly important and current matter. It's great coincidence, fortuitous, that we have Chris Doyle with us tonight. Many of you will remember his previous visits, his visit to talk about Syria 3 years ago, which was both informative and very empathetic, and I think we all left with very strong feelings after that meeting with Chris, who knows the Middle East like no one else. And if you've read the bio, I don't need to go through it. As director of CABU, he knows everyone in the Middle East and in the UK, and he knows this subject, which is hot for everyone, and he's about to get going. Welcome, Chris Doyle.
Thank you very much, Bill. I don't know really how to respond to that, the idea that I can know everyone in the Middle East and the UK. There's so many people I don't want to know. That list is probably longer than the people I do know. Anyhow, listen, it's a terrific honor to come back to Keele once again. I've been here a number of times over the years, and it's been such a pleasure. There's always a full house, which is wonderful. For those of us interested in international affairs and want people to take an interest, it's always uplifting. Because, you know, when, for example, I give talks at schools, you know, you don't always see this interest, and you don't see the belief that actually what matters in the world actually does affect us here. These conflicts do matter. And it impacts our economy, our security, our social cohesion, all of these issues. So I just attribute all that you are doing to promote this, because we live in a world that's increasingly global, whether we like it or not, and these events do affect us. And indeed, what I'm talking about tonight has affected us. We have seen attacks on shipping that have put prices up, increased inflation. We have seen risks to our security and social cohesion, and so forth. So it does matter. So thank you very much for having me again and for turning up tonight. And yeah, I called the talk "The End of Palestine from Nabka to Gaza." And I'm not going to pull away from that, even with today's news. As welcome as that is, there is a question mark there, and that question mark is doing a lot of work. And of course, with the news today, and I'm sure you've all seen it, the news that there is a ceasefire deal that has finally been agreed to by both Israel and Hamas. Of course, I've had to somewhat alter what I'm going to say, and that's a minor inconvenience, because of course it's extremely welcome. This comes 2 years after the horrific attacks on the 7th of October. It comes after what a commission of inquiry at the UN, many others, genocide experts believe has been a genocide in Gaza. That may seem controversial, but I'm afraid, to my mind, that's a reality, a harsh reality. A famine in Gaza, as testified by the IPC since August, a famine that is spreading, and a famine, regardless as to whether there is a ceasefire and aid gets in, will still be impacting that population, because it just doesn't suddenly end. Malnutrition is not something that disappears overnight. And of course, you've got hostages and detainees. There's a lot on the hostages. There may be 20 left alive, 48 in total from Israel, those who were taken on that day in 2023. But also thousands of Palestinians who've been arrested, disappeared, no trial, held in detention within Israel against international law. And their families are wondering if they are alive. We don't have the names for them. We don't know their stories and what's happened to them. So, of course, all of this is extraordinarily welcome. My God, it is. We've seen such destruction, such carnage, such displacement. 90% of the population of Gaza have been forcibly displaced, many multiple times over. Many can't move. The number of people who've lost limbs, elderly. Some are far too scared to move. This is a situation where 1 million people are in need of trauma care, half the population at least. These are estimates, of course. So, for those 3 reasons, a ceasefire, the end of the bombing, the end of, those atrocities, getting the hostages and detainees out, and getting the aid in at scale, using the United Nations, is absolutely vital. It's incredible that we have to even say that this is almost like a positive in this agreement, that the United Nations is allowed to deliver aid. Because we were in a situation where that was forbidden, that there was a deliberate state policy of using starvation as a weapon of war, denying food, water, fuel, medicines, life-saving to a civilian population under occupation. But this, in some ways, are the least problematic parts about what has been agreed. There's been a consensus on this for some time. In fact, it's pretty much a similar deal as was offered to Netanyahu a year ago, last September, and even before. The release of hostages could have happened a long time ago. So, at least we've got here, finally, to this position. And I suppose, given the ceasefires that have not held, particularly the one between January and March, we have to ask, can we expect a different result right now? What is the difference between March, when Israel decided, when the Netanyahu coalition, to break that ceasefire? I do think, in fairness, that the Trump administration is now exerting, is breaking a sweat into pulling all the pieces necessary to make this hold. And all such, conflicts do eventually end, the fighting at least. So I think there is momentum. I think there is a genuine attempt by the White House to do it. And you can be cynical. Maybe it's about the Nobel Peace Prize, but the reality is I think there is an effort. And we have to welcome that. But it could have happened before, both under the Biden administration as well as this Trump administration. And I think they have to be accountable for that too. Accountability is completely absent in all of this. They oversaw a situation where, as Trump is proving now, if you stomp your foot as the US president, then ultimately Israel, that's so dependent on your aid, on your military, on your diplomatic shielding at the UN, eventually has to come to heel and adhere. And Biden could have done that. And a lot of people's lives could have been saved, a lot of destruction could have been avoided. And they have to be held account for the fact that, yes, there was genocide, and the United States has been arming the party committing that genocide. So, the talk of Nobel Peace Prizes then, really are very premature. This is a ceasefire deal. It's not a peace deal. That's been misrepresented. What we see in those key 3 ingredients is, as I say, the easier part of it. Going forward, who will rule Gaza, the governance of Gaza? Issues about Israeli withdrawal, issues about accountability, issues about whether there will be a Palestinian state, what will happen to Hamas. There is no consensus on this at all. They will be much tougher to get people around the room to agree on. And this is what troubles me, the future. We can get through these stages. Hopefully we'll see joyous scenes of releases on Monday and aid getting in, all those trucks that have been waiting with aid to get into Gaza. But then who rules Gaza? If you look at that 20-point proposal. I don't call it a plan, because if you actually look at it, there's no sequencing, there's no time scale, there's no logical flow. It's a series of points. It actually envisages a Gaza that is not run by Palestinians, but actually, whilst there would be a technocratic committee of Palestinians who would be responsible for the day-to-day running of Gaza, it would be supervised. That's the word is used, supervised, by a board of peace, with President Trump as chairman, former Prime Minister Tony Blair on it. Palestinians are not children who can't run their own affairs. We have moved away from the era of mandates of the 1920s, when the civilized adults should determine the futures for the uncivilized natives that we were colonizing. It's very neo-colonial. This is a deal that was drawn up without any Palestinian input, determining the future for a territory that is part of the Palestinian state that the UK and France and Canada and others have just recognized. And we're saying, essentially, it should be Westerners who determine how the future governance should go, the reconstruction of Gaza, given everything has been destroyed, from hospitals to schools to universities to waterworks, churches, mosques, you name it. They will decide which companies get all the contracts. Now, are you confident that companies with close connections to the likes of Jared Kushner, Tony Blair, Donald Trump, won't pick up some of those contracts? Will Palestinian businesses be put first in the queue in the rebuilding of Gaza? Will Palestinians determine what are the priorities? After all, they've got to decide, should they rebuild the health system first? Should they rebuild the education system first? What matters? Should it not be them who make that call? Of course, and I fully understand, Hamas will not be part of that. And rightly so, they committed atrocities. But it's a strange element to all of this, that in saying that Hamas, and it's agreed it won't be part of the future governance of the Gaza Strip, that it's Hamas who is being asked to sign on to a deal that essentially outlines what should happen to Gaza. It's a contradiction. You're saying they're not fit to govern, but you're actually giving Hamas the authority to say, we agree or disagree with this particular proposal for the future of Gaza. To go forward, it has to be on the basis that if Israelis and Palestinians are to find peace, Gaza has to be free, it has to be run by Palestinians, and it has to be, and this is really crucial, of course, part of a broader polity, be it a Palestinian state, whatever, that includes the West Bank. And it is absolutely an historic Netanyahu goal to ensure that the West Bank and Gaza Strip are divided, fragmented. Geographically, no safe passage between the two, as previous accords had. Demographically, that there would be no travel between the two of them. Economically, that they don't trade with each other. Politically, that they have separate authorities under the Israeli occupation running the day-to-day affairs. And this flows throughout this Trump 20-point proposal. In fact, it does not mention the West Bank. It doesn't mention Palestine. It mentions that there could be a credible pathway at some point in the future towards a Palestinian state if certain things are achieved. There's no commitment in it. So Palestinians do not have any agency, and that matters. They should. There's also no accountability in all of this. Given the level of atrocities, including by Hamas, including by the Israeli government and authorities, the absence of any accountability is deeply troubling. Because if you really want to make sure this does not happen again, than those who have committed the worst crimes, egregious crimes. And you can disagree with what I said about genocide, but believe me, war crimes and crimes against humanity have definitely been committed. The absence of accountability will be a serious problem. But there's also no accountability in other ways as well. For example, in all the various mechanisms that are in these proposals, an economic board, a stabilization force, there's no sense that there's an accountability for what they do. Who do they answer to? The United Nations has been relegated to merely being a distributor of aid. All that wealth of experience built up of so many transitions over the years and stabilization programs is going to be ignored because Donald Trump doesn't like the United Nations and nor does Netanyahu. And that's also deeply, deeply problematic. Who are these forces? Who are these economic boards? Who's this Board of Peace answerable to? So I move now a little bit to sort of reflecting a little bit more over the last 2 years. And one thing I would say is that the outstanding feature in terms of the international community, including Britain and other major actors, has been the complete and utter failure to stop it, to prevent it, to reverse it. To see the 7th of October as the start of all of this, where actually the issue of Gaza had been a problem for decades. If you were an 18-year-old in Gaza, you would have experienced a war in 2006, 2008, 9, 2012, 2014, 2018-19, 2022, and various other Israeli military actions on Gaza. You would have probably never left Gaza. You would have never seen a river, a mountain, or many of the things that our children, grandchildren would take for granted. Gaza was hell on the 6th of October. It just got worse after the 7th of October, and we shouldn't ignore that. We failed the people of Gaza. We failed Palestinians. And it's a stain on our conscience. And we look now, and I said, you know, the end of Palestine, and we've seen all these countries recognizing it. I remember working in Parliament with MPs 2014 and pushing for that vote to recognize Palestine. It was a non-binding vote. It was overwhelmingly won. If Britain had recognized a state of Palestine in 2014, there was a chance that that could have boosted the chances for a negotiated settlement. You had a different American administration. The situation was different on the ground as well. But today, September 2025, you get these countries at the last minute coming along and saying we're going to recognize the state of Palestine, where the situation on the ground was going in exactly the opposite direction of ending any chance for a state of Palestine. So it was somewhat surreal to see this. I'm not saying I don't welcome it, but it was so late as to have lost any meaning. And it was presented as if somehow this was a punishment of Israel. It should never have been presented as a punishment of Israel. It should have been a recognition of a state because Palestinians have a right to a state and self-determination. It's deeply problematic in the way that it was done and when it was done. So we've got now 3/4 of the entire UN system recognizing a state of Palestine. Let's have a look then at what this state of Palestine might look like. Here's Gaza. This, in theory, although it doesn't say so in the Trump proposals, would be part of it. It's the size of the Isle of Wight. Oops, sorry. There's the laser. So it's 365 square kilometers. It's about the size of the Isle of Wight. 2.1, 2.3 million people. The numbers are not quite clear, and of course, we're not even sure the number of people who've been killed. We know the official figures are 67,000, 83% of them civilians, but it's hard to know. I suspect when the rubble is eventually removed. And that will take a long, long time. It's contaminated with unexploded ordnance, asbestos, God knows what. It will be hell. The purple area is currently the directly controlled area by the Israeli military. Under the proposals, there'll be 3 redeployments, but there would still be a massive Israeli buffer zone on Gazan territory at the end of it. And we don't know the timetabling of this. And this area is supposedly meant to be the safe zone where people from Gaza City up here, the largest urban area in Gaza, were told to move to in September again. It's overcrowded, people in tents, there's no real proper facilities to deal with people. You've got field medical facilities, you can't really call them hospitals. It's an utter nightmare. And even today, people were trying to get back to Gaza City and they were fired at by tanks and other projectiles because they were hoping to get back to their home. They believed there was a ceasefire. They got a rude awakening. This is overcrowded. Believe me, on the 6th of October, I would have probably said much the same. At the moment, it's really hard to see how you make this as part of a state. To rebuild it, it's going to take years. And I don't know who's going to provide the money, the funding. It's not going to be the United States. Donald Trump has no interest in that whatsoever. And it's heavily contaminated, polluted. Every day, 100 million tons of raw sewage goes into the Mediterranean. The whole area is a nightmare. And then let's have a look at the West Bank. Because if we're looking at the future, and let's say, for the sake of argument, that things proceed well in terms of Gaza. Let's say you get the ceasefire, the fighting stops, you get aid in, some reconstruction starts going forward, Hamas disarms, leaves, etc. The conflict will revert back to the radioactive core of this conflict. It's the West Bank. This is where your ultranationalist right-wing settlers, they believe this is the heart of it. This is what really matters to them. The typical attitude in Israel to Gaza is summed up by the words of former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. He said that, and I paraphrase, Gaza could fall into the sea for all I care. There's no great biblical relationship with Gaza. There was an economic interest. Yes, some people do want to annex it, but it's more a nationalist sense than a religious one. This area is what matters. This is what matters to the likes of Ben Gvir, who's in the government. And let me put in here, you got 3 million Palestinians. This is 15 times the size of Gaza. You'll see here, a lot of them on the hills of the West Bank. The Jordan Valley is largely now empty of Palestinian population, as is the Judean desert. I'm not going to go through all of this, but this is what we call Area C in the blue bit. This is under full Israeli control. This area has been under Israeli military occupation since '67. But in that area, which is contiguous, there are settlements. Now over 700,000 Israeli settlers are in the West Bank. And they have been allowed to go there, even though it's a violation of international law, in fact, a war crime under the Rome Statute that founded the International Criminal Court. For years, what have we done? We've issued press releases. The Israeli government has got very used to Britain, France, Germany, European Union issuing press releases expressing concern, saying they're illegal and against peace. It hasn't stopped them. And these are some of the settlements built all over the West Bank, sometimes over the access points to aquifers, control of water and resources, sometimes close to what we call the Green Line, which is the armistice line with Israel, and sometimes for economic reasons, as in the Jordan Valley up and down here, where you get huge plantations, dates, bananas, etc. So this is another example of this historic failure. And somehow, in all of this, we are meant to see, let me put in, these are the municipal areas that are controlled by the settlements. They also have nature reserves where Palestinians can't go. And you have firing zones where they're not allowed to go. Those firing zones where they have military exercises. In fact, there's many Palestinian villages that are told 48 hours you have to leave, we're going to be doing military exercises here, off you go. It's a mess, yeah? I mean, there's 227, this was a count some years ago by the World Bank, that well-known lefty organization, different islands of Palestinian population in that. Cities, towns, villages, herding communities. Disconnected, closed off. If I take away the settlements for the moment, you have checkpoints, you have flying checkpoints, you have earth mounds, closing off. It's fragmented, cantonized. And somehow in all of this, if we get rid of this, that's sort of roughly what would be left potentially as part of a Palestinian state in terms of the West Bank. And they talk about what they build tunnels between these different areas. That is the light brown, the grey being area C, yeah? So you could get from one to the other. They call it transportational contiguity. That's not a solution. And in this, and why the human rights community, and I totally endorse this, consider that there is a regime of apartheid in the West Bank. Very briefly, why? Essentially, if you're Israeli Jewish settler, you are under civilian law. Israeli civilian law has all the rights and protections one would expect. If you're a Palestinian who lives in a village next to one of these settlements, and here is a picture of a typical settlement and a community here. You can see the contrast. It's a herding community. It's a large settlement in the middle of the West Bank. Well, in that herding community, they're under military law, with very few of those rights and protections. And it goes to everything from building permits, zoning permits, access to water, the color of your license plate. Those Israeli settlers can vote in the Israeli elections. Palestinians cannot, of course. The whole way through. And the government of Netanyahu would like to annex all of the West Bank. But of course, those Palestinians, those 3 million Palestinians, won't get a vote within those Israeli elections. They would be taxed. They would become residents, alien residents, in a broader state of Israel. And I just wanted to briefly show you what has happened here in the closures. This hasn't quite come out right, but all sorts of closures in terms of gates, checkpoints, flying checkpoints. Well, in the last 2 years, they got a lot worse. Many, many more. We're looking at 663 obstacles to movement within the West Bank. It means getting from one town to another, if you're a Palestinian, is almost, well, it takes hours. What should be a 20-minute journey would be a 2-hour journey. You want to go from Bethlehem to Ramallah, it would be several hours. You're not sure how long it's going to take. If you're an Israeli settler, you can go across all of this area with ease. So, is this the future? This is what has to be undone. This is, why, when you hear today some of the rather overblown language, it's peace, historic day, all the rest of it, I think those of us who've been there and seen Gaza and seen the West Bank know that this is a start, yes, but we have a long, long way to go. I suspect that there's a lot of questions coming up, and I'm really happy to go into all of that, and to finish up there. But just to say in conclusion that in previous conflicts with Gaza, and we've got ceasefires, we had ceasefire agreements that lasted several years, but we never got to a proper peace deal. We never actually resolved the situation. We left it as it was. Gaza under blockade, not allowed to get the proper quantities of vital necessities to build their economy. No port, no airport. Before October the 7th, they were 80% dependent. The poverty levels were off the charts. Medicines were short in all sorts of categories. It would be an utter travesty if we went back to the status quo ante. And there's a real danger of that. So for all of these deals that may or may not take root, this is for the long haul. It's going to take time. The prize is worth it. If we can take some of the tension out of the Middle East, maybe lead to other agreements with Arab states as well, with Iran, of course, then the world will be a better place for it. But I would just urge you to look a little bit beyond the rather ridiculous rhetoric that we've heard in the last few days. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, everyone, for coming back so promptly. You have absolutely deluged us with questions. I will do my best. And as you know, we have to finish at the crack of 9:15 so that Chris can return to London. As you can imagine, he's in great demand. There's just one thing that, just a tiny detail from your talk, Chris. I thought we'd just sort of get that out of the way from Jackie Hemingway. And that was you used the word tunnels. Well, of course, we think of tunnels and Gaza. You talked about tunnels in the West Bank. You said that many separate Palestinian settlements were connected by tunnels, or they would need to be connected. Maybe you could clarify that. And she obviously thinks that they're totally associated with tunnels being used to pop out and attack Israel or Israelis. So could you sort of clarify that?
Totally, yeah. No, these are tunnels that actually Israel has approved the building of. I mean, you can't really build anything without Israeli approval in the West Bank. So they're designed to ensure that a particular community that might be surrounded by settlements and actually can't get out would have a tunnel which would go under road, and that therefore Israeli settlers and Palestinians would not mix. You can see many of these communities actually just north of Jerusalem. And they call it fabric of life roads. That's another of the expressions that they come up with. And of course, if you have that and a community is dependent upon that, then of course it's also easy to close them off. You put a barrier in the middle of the tunnel and then that community cannot leave. So we see that all over the West Bank. So it's very different to what are tunnels that are designed for either smuggling, and for years the Gazan economy was dependent on tunnels under the border with Egypt to supply them with essential goods, to cement, but also those who took it in, weapons, drugs, etc. And of course a fear that such tunnels might spread to the West Bank. But this is also what I would, say to, Israeli leaders and strategists. It's like, is this the way you want to go? Because if you're always using a hammer, if you're always using military force, you're going to find that Palestinians and others will find means to try to take the fight back to you. And you've been fighting Hamas since 1987. You've been fighting Hezbollah since 1982. at what stage do you realize that force is not actually going to provide you a solution?
Some questions about U.S. relationship with Israel. I'll try to cover them, and you have to give a simple answer. Ian Duadoff, can you explain why the U.S. has been so supportive of Israel for so long? Is it the Jewish vote, or does Israel have some secret stranglehold over the U.S.? He thinks this sounds a bit like a conspiracy theory for which he apologizes, but you might sort of cast light on that. Yes, David, the same. Why is the US so invested? And Sean King, why? And I'll come on to that later. You can perhaps talk about why successive UK governments and media are, as he thinks, so supportive of Israel.
The US relationship. Thank you for that question, Ian. No, it is not the Jewish vote. And with great respect, I don't think there is really such a thing. American Jews have an extraordinary range of opinions. And I'd point you to a recent opinion poll in the Washington Post that showed that 40% of Jewish Americans consider that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. 40%. And that actually shows you, I think, what the media is not highlighting, that actually Jews in many countries have a whole variety of opinions, as is quite normal, and very strong viewpoints. And they're not all endorsing what Netanyahu is doing. Some are acutely embarrassed about it. There are many Jews in this country who have been out on protests and visuals. Now, that's not to say there aren't many British Jews who are also very supportive of what's going on, or mildly supportive, but it's just to say they don't behave and act as one single group any more than to Arabs or Muslims. There is a multiplicity of views, and we need to think more like that. What really makes the United States back Israel? It's a very good question. In terms of voting, if you wanted to look at it in those terms, actually it's more the Christian evangelical right that is a large bloc vote. So those are votes that Donald Trump looked to get. His previous vice president was, seen to be very important in that, and they give a lot of support to Israel. Yet their beliefs, particularly if you really look at them, of the ingathering of Jews to the land of Israel, to the Holy Land, is profoundly anti-Semitic, that this would herald the end of days and so forth. I think it was an Israeli leader once was asked about that, and he said, well, we'll deal with that problem when it comes to it. In other words, we'll take their support regardless of the fact they actually have some pretty unpleasant views. But I think there are other reasons. Israel has portrayed itself as a very useful ally to the United States in the Middle East. It has done so particularly since 1967, when that relationship really took off. Before 1967, it wasn't quite like that. Remember that it was Dwight Eisenhower who compelled the British and French and the Israelis to withdraw from Egypt in 1956. It was Kennedy who started to raise serious questions about the Israeli nuclear program at Dimona. He was told it was a chocolate factory, and it lies to an American president. It's changed. Biden was very loyal to Israel, if not Netanyahu, hence his lack of criticism. But Trump is, as ever, a very different creature. He thinks of his own interests solely. And a couple of times, including, within the last week or two, and including in June over Iran, he's stomped his foot and got irritated with Netanyahu. I found what was interesting in that Monday meeting with Netanyahu in the Oval Office, the fourth time this year that Trump has met a man who is wanted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes and crimes against humanity, was the way that Netanyahu was forced to read out a scripted apology to Qatar down the phone that Trump was holding. And the White House released photographs of this happening. That's not what you do to a friend. So it's a checkered relationship, and there's arguments as to, to what extent Israel influences the United States, and to what extent the United States influences Israel. You can read different theorists on this. I say sometimes it goes both ways. On occasions, Israel exercises undue influence over an American president. Sometimes an American president, can exert extreme influence. Clinton once said in leaving a meeting with Netanyahu back in 1996, he came out very frustrated and said, God, who's the superpower in this relationship? So, yeah, a difficult relationship, but of course the United States giving huge amounts of support economically and otherwise, is complicit in what Israel does. And I would say actually its reputation globally has suffered. So the idea that it has been an asset to the United States, I think, should be challenged.
We're going to come back to one or two of the things that you said there, Chris, but I'd like to switch to the subject of Hamas. There's a series of questions, but maybe we can sort of tease some ideas out. Maddie Hopley says, well, the US is backing Israel. Who's backing Hamas, if anyone at the moment? Paul Hemingway, given the history, why do you believe that Hamas did what it did on October the 7th? They surely must have realized the carnage that would ensue in Gaza. Peter Holcroft, apart from the total desperation, what motivated Hamas to take on one of the best-funded military nations in the world? And did they anticipate the consequences? Let's go there.
Great and very relevant questions. Who's backing Hamas is perhaps easier to answer. Not many right now, but if you take it back a few years, certainly Iran was giving it support financially in terms of training and so forth. Qatar was hosting the Hamas leadership since 2012 when Hamas left Syria. It left Syria because it had a profound disagreement with the Assad regime. And the Americans and the Israelis were involved in this, negotiated with the Qataris to take the Hamas leadership because they didn't want Hamas to land up going to Iran. And actually for years, and this is a debate within Israel, Netanyahu had a rather cozy relationship with Hamas in terms of ensuring that monies went through. You may see some of the bribery and corruption scandals that have involved him and he's on trial for. And he was quite happy. And there's a record of what he said in terms of, Qatar keeps Gaza going, and that's great, and it keeps Hamas in power. That's what I want. And it was part of Netanyahu's ambition to see this divided leadership. If you had Hamas, then the Palestinian national movement, that he considers to be the greater enemy for Israel, would be weakened. That was the same policy of Sharon. It's a divide and rule. A Palestinian national leadership would be one that could procure a Palestinian state. Islamist Hamas will never be accepted in the White House and elsewhere. Be easy to turn on if you have to. And that's roughly what happened. Why did October the 7th happen? Is there a rational answer to that? I mean, let's be really clear. They were atrocities. And so I'm not sure there's a clear answer to this. One can start speculating. I think, first of all, you have to think in terms of who within Hamas decided to do this, orchestrated it, planned it. There's a leadership element to this. And that leadership is divided. Remember that there's the leadership within Hamas, there's the leadership that is based in Doha, there is the leadership of Hamas actually within Israeli prisons. Palestinian prisoners have a huge say and cachet in Palestinian politics. So who knew, who didn't know? One theory, which I think has some validity, is that it was done to prevent a normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel. That's one theory. Though I was in Saudi Arabia just before October the 7th, and it was far from clear that this was going ahead, that the Saudis were really minded to do this, give Biden a political victory. They probably preferred Trump. They had all sorts of reasons why they weren't really sure that a normalization deal should go through, not least because basically the Crown Prince, who runs things in Saudi Arabia on a day-to-day basis, said, well, we want a defense pact, we want this. They had a shopping list. And if the Americans weren't prepared to give in to that shopping list, then we're not going to do normalization. Was it frustration? I think that might explain why young guys within Gaza who hadn't left it and all the rest of it, an 18-year-old, probably taking, various drugs, etc., including Captagon, were prepared to breach that wall, the fence, and go into these communities. They probably wouldn't have needed much encouragement, revenge for what had happened to them. Were they shocked and surprised how much easier it was than they had expected? Quite possibly. Maybe they'd hoped to breach it, perhaps knock over some of the military watchtowers. But I suspect they thought, as I think most Israelis thought, that the Israeli military would be on their case much, much earlier than they were. Israel was caught napping in its biggest security failure since 1973. So it's really quite hard. What I would say to those, I'm not saying anybody in the room thinks like this, but I've had this conversation, who say, well, they had a right to resist, what else were they supposed to do? I've had that thrown at me. But I would push back and say, what has Hamas achieved in these attacks for Palestinian rights, for Palestinian freedom? Nothing. It's gone totally back. It's given the far right in Israel every reason to smash Gaza, to annihilate Gaza, to build settlements at a faster rate, to have settler violence. It has not achieved anything. It's put back the legitimate quest for Palestinian rights decades. So I have no time for those sorts of views. I totally understand the frustrations that Palestinians in Gaza were feeling. The world was ignoring them. They were locked up, and nobody was doing anything. I get that, but it doesn't mean that going killing 1,200 people, many of them civilians, was the way to go about it, and take 250 hostages.
I'm going to take another question about Hamas, which probably should come later, given your earlier talk, but let's do it now. This is Cass Holland. Won't this new agreement lead to a new generation of Hamas freedom fighters looking to avenge what Israel and the USA have done to Gaza, or will be doing to Gaza? So have you already processed that in your analysis, and have you got any thoughts?
I think that the answer is yes. It may not be Hamas. Maybe it'll be a different group called something else, in the way that, Al-Qaeda or part of Al-Qaeda became, ISIS, etc. So are there a lot of extremely angry, frustrated, Palestinians who might want to take the fight to Israel to gain revenge because of the loss of all their families and what has happened, the absolutely indescribable level of suffering that's been visited upon them? Yes. Do I think that Israeli actions have seeded generations of hatred? Yes, which is why I sort of said I think strategically, tactically, Israel's been brilliant. It's taken out Hezbollah leadership, the pager attacks. It's been able to kill a Hamas leader in Tehran. All operations they've carried out without any loss to themselves. But strategically, in terms of where Israel is going, I think that's alarming, because they're not bringing themselves into a situation where they're going to have normal, friendly relations with their neighbors. And let's take it away from the Palestinians a little bit. They're currently still in large parts of Lebanon, which is bombed nearly every day. They have taken over further swathes of Syrian territory, which is also being bombed on a frequent basis and away from a lot of media coverage. So there's even less coverage of the civilian casualties as to those bombings. They've bombed Iran, and there's a real serious risk in the next few months we will see more attacks on Iran. And they're in a conflict with the Houthis in Yemen. It's, if I was an Israeli, I'd be worried about the security of the state in 10, 20, 30 years. And I don't think they needed to be in this situation.
Let's stay with Israel, but the Israelis, or the population in there. Peter Gray, will the Israeli population ever come to terms with what their government has done? And Andrew Swindale, he's now thinking about the Arabs who live in Israel and what their reaction and position might be about both the Gaza conflict and the settlement in the West Bank. And I'll add on, possibly, about their own status if they are Israelis. So could we talk about the people in Israel?
Yeah, Israelis coming to terms with what they've done. The first stage, that is to actually understand and accept what they have done. Israeli friends who disagree with what's going on, tell me, that the media coverage barely really references the impact of Israeli bombing, shelling policies on Palestinian civilians in Gaza. It's not really featured. The tone, the language used in terms of describing Palestinians has got a lot worse, and it was bad before the 6th of October. Every year there's a Jerusalem Day march, and you get these largely Israeli right nationalists marching through saying, we're going to burn your villages, death to Arabs, death to Arab marches. These were going on. Nobody was arrested for this. There was no prime ministerial statement condemning that sort of language and tone. So the first thing actually is to internalize what they've done. Now, there's actually a lot of Israelis, of course, who fought in Gaza, and we've seen increased suicide rates. And at some point, I think that because so many Israelis have served there and done reserve duties, there will be a sort of breaking the silence. Some of you may know the Israeli group Breaking the Silence, which is a group of former Israeli soldiers who, in their own way of describing it, break this culture of silence about what they've done in the occupied territories. That when you've served there, a lot of Israelis then go abroad on a sort of gap year. They'll go to Southeast Asia or South America just to get over it. And it's to break the silence because in Israel, it's a highly militarized society. You do national service. The army is absolutely at the heart of Israel, to defend it, etc., for all those reasons. And it's quite difficult to break out and to actually be honest about what happened. There were testimonies about the 2014 war in Gaza, quite explicit about what they did. The thing about what we're seeing in Gaza is that this has been live streamed. We know, we have the evidence, we have the videos, we have the testimonies, doctors who served there, Israeli soldiers included, who have come out and spoken about it. And yet still, the world is inactive. Some people say, what about ex-conflict, these people, etc. And yes, the world has ignored other conflicts. I could talk about Sudan. Syria as often drops off the news. But the fact that Gaza is in the news, and we see what goes on, and we know it, and we have the UN reports, the Israeli human rights groups reports, actually makes it worse. We have no excuse not to have done something, not to have held those responsible to account. So I think Israel is going to have a challenge in coming to terms with all of this. Palestinian citizens of Israel. So just by way of background, a fifth of the population of Israel are non-Jewish, largely Palestinian Arabs. There's some Druze and others. They have citizenship, which gives them greater privileges than their Palestinian counterparts who don't in the occupied Palestinian territory, or should we say the occupied state of Palestine. But they don't have full rights. And in two principal areas, one is land ownership, and the other one actually is also relates to issues of citizenship in terms of course, if you're Jewish anywhere in the world, you can come and live in Israel. But they don't have equal rights. There are also a lot of communities, what we call unrecognized villages, who were not put on any town planning scheme after the creation of the State of Israel. I visited and actually lived in some. There's quite a lot in the Negev in the south, but also in the Galilee. And they don't get any municipal services, they don't appear on any map, and they don't get the right to vote in municipal elections. So there's lots of other ways in which, they don't get equal rights. But of course, they do get greater privileges than their counterparts. They find it very difficult. It's really challenging for them because they are part of one social cultural fabric. The Palestinian people, they speak the same language, have the same culture. As I said, 3/4 of the population of Gaza are Palestinians from what is today Israel. So they have family links. They're not separate peoples. So for them to see what is going on in Gaza is hellish for them. And often they are seen, because they are Israeli citizens, there is some backlash, amongst those Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory. What are you doing to help us? But they're worried. They're worried their rights will be taken away from them. They're worried that, they don't get the same level of resources, same level of policing. And there's a lot of parties who actually are calling for expulsion of Palestinian citizens of Israel, the likes of Avigdor Lieberman. So they feel they have a tenuous status they don't want to lose. And you also have, just to add into the mix, Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem, who have a slightly better status than Palestinians in the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory. They have residency rights. They get a travel permit. They don't get citizenship. They can vote if they wish to, though many don't in Jerusalem municipal elections, not in national elections. So they are also worried about losing those rights, being kicked out of Jerusalem. So it's very difficult when the control is not in your hands.
There's quite a few questions along the lines of, for instance, if you like, the historical destiny of the Jews and the extent to which modern Israelis are influenced by that. So one question mentions the Holy Land. Philip Alcott wonders whether some Israelis are in a state of denial and using the Holocaust as a justification. Can you just give us a quick pen portrait of that population and their? We need to know: are all these people, the settlers, are they the minority? Is it a minority that's dictating what happens? And are there a lot of well-thinking Israelis just wishing what was happening in Israel, the policies weren't taking place?
Well, Israel is a very, very divided society. And if you go back to the earlier part of 2023, what was going on was huge protests against the Netanyahu coalition's assault on the judiciary, typically of these populist leaders that are going after the judiciary. Netanyahu wanted to do that for all sorts of reasons, not least to save his own skin, to ensure that he wouldn't be put on trial. And you saw hundreds of thousands of Israelis protesting about that. But it's very divided in all sorts of ways. You've got Tel Aviv, that's largely a liberal, not particularly religious city. You've got the business areas. You've got high-tech Israel that is, has flourished in terms of tech and comms and drones and all this sort of stuff. But then you have, areas like Jerusalem that's become increasingly orthodox, more religious, more conservative. And it's like two different worlds. And many Israelis in Tel Aviv don't want to go to Jerusalem, and many in the more orthodox settlements don't want to go near Tel Aviv, and they see Tel Aviv as abhorrent, as one said to me. So Israel's very divided. It's also very divided at countries of origin, by generation, by politics. And, should the conflict come to some form of end, there's going to be, a lot of those tensions are coming out. The biggest one, perhaps in recent times, even during the last 2 years, has been whether the Haredim should serve in the army. It caused Shas to leave the coalition, the ultra-Orthodox party. But for the people working in business, in these high-tech companies in Haifa and places, they're going, right, so we're serving in the army. we are boosting the Israeli economy and making money. And these guys are sitting in yeshiva, not contributing to the economy, in fact, draining it, and they're not serving in the military to defend the country. So these are the tensions that are there. So it is very divided, and it's therefore also very divided in terms of attitudes towards Palestinians and what should happen. And you can see that in terms of also, the only area they're really united at the moment is an increasing distaste and distrust for Netanyahu. I mean, that really is. It's like, he is a supreme political operator, certainly outmaneuvers all his rivals within Israel and has consistently done so. That's why he's been the most, he's been prime minister for the longest time in Israeli history. But he is not trusted. He's not trusted by former American presidents. He's not trusted by Donald Trump, I don't think. Barack Obama had some pretty unkind words to say on mic to Nicolas Sarkozy. So, yeah, I mean, I think Israel's in a difficult place, and they have their own history, a troubled history, of course, and one that makes them worry as to whether the Jewish state will survive or not. One has to understand those fears. They're not made up, they are legitimate. It doesn't mean that it justifies all that they do.
Quite a few questions are about the Israeli leadership, and I suppose the nub of it, here's Julie Rowley. Do you foresee a change in Israel's leadership? And Jeff Pettingill, there are many problems and barriers that you've talked about in the way of the peace deal, and he sees one of them as Netanyahu. When and how do you think he will go? Can you look at the political runes and he's been around a long time. Does anyone have any sense of how long he can carry on?
Well, I've learnt not to write him off, and there isn't some, young Israeli political figure who's setting the world alight that somehow could be, the great hope. Many of the people that, might take over, like Naftali Bennett and the likes, have been tried before. So there's nobody out there that looks fresh and exciting. And so there is an argument to say that somehow he might manipulate the situation to see them off. The trouble is, although Israelis have voted for different parties in recent elections and so forth, essentially out of 120 seats in the Knesset, roughly about 70 have gone to the right. So there's an inbuilt majority for the right wing of Israeli politics. There's a collapse of the historic Labour left. The Labour Party barely exists anymore. The centre is not very strong. And it means that there's always some sort of coalition of the right. And the division in the right is really based on whether they can work with Netanyahu or not. Avigdor Lieberman decided he couldn't. Naftali Bennett decided he couldn't. And others too, one or two former Israeli army generals, chiefs of staff. But eventually Netanyahu will leave the scene, of course. And I don't think it'll be that long. But I think his strategy in terms of his own political survival has been to keep the crisis going, always escalate. That's what we've seen in the last 2 years. At any moment that it looks like it all could calm down, you escalate. You either open a new front or you break a ceasefire, and he has options to do this. I mentioned Iran. Of course, there was that 12-day war in June, but it would be perfectly feasible that he could start arguing very shortly that Iran is rebuilding its nuclear capacity and we had to take action and order new strikes. Suck the Americans into that conflict again as well. He could escalate with the Houthis. He can escalate it in Syria. He can escalate it above all where I think the conflict will go in the West Bank. And in that, he'll keep his coalition together because that's where it really matters. So they can go forward with major Israeli settlement plans. I didn't mention E1. It's a huge plan to the east of Jerusalem that essentially divides the West Bank north and south. But there's other ones also that are what we call doomsday settlements. It will make it even more impossible than it is right now to have a viable, contiguous Palestinian state. And then he can proclaim himself to be the champion of the settlers. Maybe he'll be able to proclaim an historic victory over Hamas, that it's defeated. Maybe when those hostages get released, let's hope on Monday, Sunday, the public opinion will start crediting him for some of this. I don't know. How will it go down within Israel? It could backfire on him. You could get a lot of stories about how horrifically they've been treated. You could get more stories about how many times Netanyahu has missed an opportunity to get them out. I think it's quite up in the air. But he will argue that he has delivered historic victories. He's weakened Iran, he's weakened Hamas, he's weakened Hezbollah, he's weakened Israeli enemies. Therefore, you should invite me in for another term and keep me going and keep me out of the courts. The question is, will those who are opposed to him be able to unite around a single figure, a single party, who can actually come up with a program that will appeal to the Israeli public? Because he's not trusted. The opinion poll ratings for him are very low, so it's conceivable.
Chris, we have a question in the balcony. Could you bring the microphone forward? It's in the center, second row.
Good evening. It's on, yes. You hinted at the support from the rest of the world, from the part of the rest of the world. Exactly why is Netanyahu and the Israelis getting away with what they're doing? Who's supporting them really?
Okay. Well, I think if you took the United States out of the equation, not many really. You can make an argument for Germany. But even then, I think Germany would probably quickly fall into line with a broader European consensus, on Israel to take harsher measures. But it's the United States, let's be quite clear. And, as a result of what's happened in the last 2 years, Israel is more isolated than it ever has been. And you can see that in terms of the countries that have recognized Palestine, in terms of the increasing number of sanctions, and, look at the opinion polls of public opinion, and even where a government is possibly, including in this country, mildly sympathetic to Israel, depending on how you see it, certainly unwilling to take meaningful action, including sanctions against Israel, which I believe should happen. The public opinion is strongly in favor of taking such actions. There is a big chasm between the political leaderships of many countries and public opinion that is outraged, and the way in which the political classes and some of the media portray those who decide to go and protest, for example. Yes, for certain, there's some protesters who have used language that I would never condone, but the overwhelming majority of people who have gone out in the streets have done so because they're horrified as to what's happened and the lack of action by the UK in trying to stop it. And that, I think, is deeply problematic. But I think actually most of the world is pretty appalled at what's going on, and for good reason.
I'd like to switch to TV. Tony Blair. Several questions. Do you think Tony Blair and his institute will help or hinder? You may not want to answer these questions since we're getting closer to home, but I'll leave that to you.
I'll answer that one, I can tell you.
Given Tony Blair's Iraq legacy, do you think that he can take an effective role? And what makes Tony Blair an expert on Middle East peace? Exclamation mark from Jan Ferguson. So I think we see the trend in the questions.
Well, Tony Blair was my meal ticket into the media for a number of years when he was Middle East Quartet envoy, because I'd be almost the go-to person for a journalist to ring up to slag him off. Tony Blair, I remember meeting him with MPs shortly after he got appointed the Middle East Quartet envoy in 2007, and he said, "Hi guys, I never realized how complicated it was out here, you know. You're just going, oh, Jesus, you know. So don't underestimate the ignorance of our political class in this conflict. I kid you not, I stood with an MP in Manger Square in Bethlehem, and that MP, who was touted as a potential leader of his party, turned to me and said, "Chris, remind me, what went on here?" And I sort of like, you mean the birth of Jesus Christ? Yeah. You know, so Tony Blair has, you know, his only expertise comes as sort of, you know, as a prime minister who is involved in talking in that rarefied atmosphere that we don't inhabit with other heads of state who likewise largely don't know much about what's going on in the ground. And, you know, that was his problem on Iraq. He never understood what the implications would have been about invading and occupying Iraq. Didn't understand that we were not going to be welcomed, that a country that we had sanctioned with the most harshest sanctions regime in modern history was not going to be welcoming American and British troops, that they had seen what, you know, various American presidents and prime ministers said about Iraq. So, yeah, I think it's deeply problematic, and it's deeply problematic also because when he was Quartet envoy, and even now, he never really calls out those major violations of international law. There's no ethical, you know, moral compass involved in all of this. And his office was very upset with me because I said as Quartet envoy he had a conflict of interest because he had so many business dealings in the Middle East. He was advising the Egyptian government, Hosni Mubarak. Well, Egypt was, you know, a party to this. It, you know, it controlled the, you know, Gaza-Egyptian border over which, you know, or under which, you know, stuff was going, including weapons. I mean, when Blair met with Mubarak, was he talking as his consultant, his business advisor, or as the Quartet envoy representing, you know, the United Nations, the United States, the European Union, and Russia? You know, and he had business dealings in the Emirates, and he still does. So when he is on this board of peace, is he going to recuse himself from any discussion that might have a relationship to one of those numerous business contracts? I don't believe it, nor would Donald Trump, and he's got a lot of conflicts of interest and interesting conflicts. So, you know, Jared Kushner, you can add into the mix. Tony Blair had his chance, and in those 8 years as Quartet envoy, it was diplomatic famine. He didn't really push anything forward. He failed to speak out. And he failed to speak out over the last 2 years. Where is Tony Blair talking about what was going on when a population were being collectively starved as a matter of policy? Where was he when Israeli leaders were making genocidal comments to annihilate Gaza, that all Palestinians in Gaza are collectively guilty, etc., etc.? One could go and talk about them. He didn't speak out. He has no credibility amongst Palestinians. Whoever should be on that board of peace should at least, not that I think that structure should exist, Palestinians should believe that they are there to try to fight for their interests, aspirations, and future. They will not have any confidence that Trump and Blair are doing that at all.
I think you've answered that question brilliantly, and I think we're running out of time. I just want to squeeze a few more before we rush you to the station. A quick word about the role of the Arab states. So Trump is suggesting that they're going to be greatly involved in the so-called next steps and, quote, pour money into the rebuilding of Gaza. So several people, Amy Dixie and Mitch Vansel, wonder if that's going to happen.
There's what Trump says and there's what leaders of Arab states have said, and they don't always quite match. And, you know, surprise. I mean, basically, the Arab states are nervous about this. Donald Trump has got them in a little bit of vice. They don't want to offend him, just like Keir Starmer doesn't want to offend him. Everybody, you know, is nervous about what Trump will do. He can impose massive tariffs on you or withdraw security coordination or whatever. I mean, you don't know what he's going to do. So he comes out and says all these Arab states have promised to contribute financially. They're going to pay for the reconstruction, and they're going to commit to sending troops in this international stabilization force. And they're going, sorry, we didn't quite sign up to that, because they want some guarantees. They're not going to invest billions into Gaza to have Israel bomb it again, because they've seen this story. This is not the first time there's been a war on Gaza. So, you know, they don't want to be paying for something without the proper guarantees. Are those guarantees in there, in that 20-point plan? Absolutely not. Startlingly absent. There is no guarantee from the United States publicly declared that Israel will not go back in. They're not even guaranteeing that the Israeli forces would leave Gaza. So why build a hospital to have it bombed in 5 years? So what will be, if they send troops from Arab states and Turkey, under whose command? Under whose terms of combat? What happens if Israeli soldiers shoot Saudi soldiers in Gaza? Who sorts that out? So, yes, they're very supportive of those initial steps, as I said in the talk. Definitely. They want to see an end of it. They're far less convinced by the rest of it. Even our own government didn't refer to it as a plan. They called it Trump's initiative. And I think that shows that even in the Foreign Office and Downing Street, they realize that this isn't a fully fleshed out plan at all. Far from it.
You won't believe this, but Chris Nibbs, wants me to ask the audience a question and not you.
Excellent.
So I don't know whether we should. We don't normally have votes, but his question, by the way, is for show of hands, who would support Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize? Shall we have a show of hands? And now can we have your answer? Well, you saw that answer.
I'm going to dissent.
You're with them, okay.
If giving Trump the Nobel Peace Prize means that he will ensure that aid gets into Gaza, the hostages and detainees are released, that there is a proper ceasefire that lasts more than a few days and lasts permanently, and that actually there is a credible pathway to a Palestinian state, and that there will be no annexation of any territory, and that there will be no settlements, and there will be a justice accountability, he can have a Nobel Peace Prize.
Thank you. I'm going to finish with the word peace, which has not actually appeared much in our discussion, has it? So a couple of members are wondering if there's a glimmer of hope, and so Dave Bayliss and Ray Beecham, from your experience and your knowledge, what would be the next steps to peace? And some of the other questions are wondering about, if there is any chance, would it be a single-state solution or a two-state solution? Let's finish on that.
That's great. I mean, I think, look, this is a moment of opportunity. I don't want to get away from that. And I think that what needs to happen right now is to take those first 3 steps. Let's get those over the line and done. And I hope that will create a slightly different dynamic. Aid getting into Gaza. Imagine, babies no longer dying of malnutrition. Over 400 are done. Those hostages released. Prisoners, detainees. That starts to create a different dynamic. Create a dynamic that nobody, Israelis, Palestinians, and others, want to go back to where we've been. That then could hopefully create a climate in which there could be some proper negotiations over what really could be done for Gaza and the West Bank, leading to a solution. It's certainly not there in the Trump plan. And if I'm going to express a bit of optimism, Trump was quite flexible in this. He produced this plan. And it said that Hamas had to release hostages in 72 hours. But the fact that then he sent his negotiators off to Egypt to actually negotiate a little bit more of the detail shows that he didn't see it as a sacred text. So there's that in it. I think he's a little bit more, he wants to get this over the line in some ways. I think he does think about his legacy a little bit. So that's some of my optimism on that. It doesn't go very far, but there's a lot more optimism than I had a month ago. Let's face it. So, we have a chance. So it's one state, two state, some sort of solution that doesn't involve ethnic cleansing. I mean, ethnic cleansing had to be essentially written into that Trump proposal and saying that we won't force anybody out of Gaza. I mean, that tells you a lot, that you actually had to put that in. There are possibilities. I do think it will require a different leadership in Israel. I'm not sure if this American president... I mean, maybe Trump will do things differently. He's not quite as beholden to Israel as Biden was, who, really did so little and was an absolute failure. Who knows? Will Europe start, talking, somebody asked about whether the international community would work, but Europe is weak because we're not united. And there are players that Israel has worked on very hard, like Hungary, that prevent a unanimous decision at the European Union level. But Britain, France, and Germany together could work more effectively. I think regional states do want to see something. Israel does want normalization with Saudi. There are certain things that Israel wants. But you mustn't give that up unless Israel is prepared to do what is necessary to get a state. Two states? Well, it has to be a state that is meaningful, viable, independent, a Palestinian state. Security not just for Israelis, but for Palestinians too. That agreement I didn't mention also talked about de-radicalization. I'm not sure what that means. It talks about Palestinians in Gaza being de-radicalized, by the way, not the Israeli leaders who are dehumanizing Palestinians and calling them all sorts of things and calling for them to be united, to be annihilated. So, yeah, there's a chance. It's going to need a lot of hard work, and we can't allow this to suddenly drop off the agenda in a couple of weeks' time because there's a ceasefire. That's a big risk.
There we need to stop because tempus fugit. What an unbelievable evening. I'm so deeply grateful to Chris for coming here, and I think you will have the same feeling. And a rich and deep evening that was promised to you. Who better than Chris Doyle to explain it all to us? Thank you so much for coming again. Well done. Well done.